Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Ambassador Shankar Menon, former Foreign Secretary, former National Security Advisor, former Ambassador to China, one of India's most respected strategic analysts. Mr. Menon, thank you for talking to ThePrint.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
So, Mr. Menon, this is my first question to you is in the wake of the disengagement or de-escalation or reported withdrawal by Chinese troops at the line of actual control in Ladakh. These last few weeks, both armies have been in close proximity. There was this brutal clash on the 15th of June in which 20 Indian soldiers were killed. Your first comments?
Well, I think it's a good thing if we do manage to disengage, and if in the many places where actually troops are face-to-face in very close proximity, if we can separate them. But of course, this can only be a first step towards a restoration of the status quo ante. Because I hear many words being used, disengagement, buffer zones, various things which suggest that there will be separation of troops. Now whether it's on our side of the line, their side of the line, equally on both sides, none of that is clear. Whether we'll be able to resume patrolling as we used to up to our line, none of that is clear. But so it seems to me that as a first step to prevent further clashes and certainly further loss of life, but even just brawls and so on, disengagement is welcome. But I hope it leads ultimately to a restoration of the status quo before all these hotspots flared up.
Are you concerned that it may not, and that these words like the buffer zone and other terms that are being bandied about could mean that both armies are pulling back, but they may not come back to either side of the line of actual control that they were in early May?
Honestly, Jyoti, we don't know enough. And so to actually say this is what's happening and therefore this is the dangers, it's very hard because both governments are being, I think, deliberately vague and ambiguous. And it's natural because no army or government wants to discuss operational details in public and to limit the scope of what it can negotiate or not by taking public positions which are very firm, very harsh. But I do think that governments owe it to their own people to at least be clear about the goals, about where they are going and what they are aiming at. And in this case, frankly, restoration of the status quo is something that both sides have signed repeated agreements, international agreements, which commit them to restoring the status quo. So I do hope that at least that minimum is done. What else they do on top of it is up to them.
Right. So again, newspaper reports which say that the Chinese side wanted a conversation with the Indian government, and which is how Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and the national security advisor Ajit Doval did have these talks on Sunday. Do you think that this is the Chinese asking for some sort of face saving?
Who asked for the talks? Obviously, one side or the other would have to ask. But I think it was clear from the beginning that both sides wanted to dial down the tension. And if you notice, the rhetoric was nowhere near on the Chinese side. After all, they initiated this. But the rhetoric was nowhere near what it was during Doklam, the official rhetoric.
Right.
Global Times might have said what it wants, but so does Republic TV. And, nobody takes either seriously. That's not official.
So what do you make of that? What do you make of the rhetoric being so different now from...
And if you look at the social media as well, this time was much less vituperative on the Chinese side than it was previously. So it seems to me that, we're at a time when everybody has other things to worry about. COVID, the economy, people's lives have been totally disrupted. And I don't think that this is an issue. Yes, it arouses passion, certainly. But I don't think it's the kind of situation that we've had in the past. I think it was clear from the beginning, both governments, having done what they did, wanted to dial it down. And they have taken a first tentative step. But it's also clear that what the Chinese did was unprecedented and has actually shaken the foundations of the understandings which existed between the two sides, which have kept the peace for several years, for decades, for
Right.
over 4 decades on this line. Ill-defined it might be, but the peace has been kept. And that has been broken. And therefore,
Are you talking about the debts? Are you talking about the debts of the?
I'm talking about the debts. I'm talking about reopening the question of where the LAC lies. I'm talking about preventing India from patrolling as it has in the past for several years, and preventing that in not just one area, but in a whole series of areas.
So how do you think India should respond if this is so different from what has been before?
I think we need to respond at several levels. I think obviously the Indian Army knows what to do militarily, and frankly, we shouldn't be sitting here second guessing what they know. They know professionally what to do, how to do it. But I think we need, as a government, needs to respond diplomatically, needs to respond politically, needs to respond strategically by creating capacities, leverage, and creating a situation where we cannot be surprised again. Okay. And where we cannot be presented with a fait accompli by actions by the other side. And I think, therefore, it has to look at the entire relationship and how we plan to take it forward, and do this alone, but also with the Chinese side to gauge where exactly they're going.
With the Chinese side?
Well, you have to talk to the Chinese also, because Chinese behavior has changed. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to understand where they're coming from, what they are trying to do here. You might not like what you find out, but that doesn't matter. But this is a relationship that involves two sides to it. And therefore, whatever that relationship, whatever results, which will be different from what we had in the past, will be the result of what both sides do. You can't just do this unilaterally, either you or the Chinese, because each side will react to the other.
So the first thing that the government has done is that it has banned these 59 Chinese apps. There have been several statements by several ministers about not allowing the Chinese to participate in tenders, say, for example, in roads and highways and the railways. You know, the economic relationship, that you're trying to withdraw from that and trying to sort of hurt the Chinese or punish the Chinese.
Well, there's three parts to this. I think one is dealing with the immediate crisis, right? And preventing it from getting worse, degenerating. But then I think actually the crisis gives you an opportunity to reset your economic relationship with China, which anyway you were not very happy with. Right. Not just because of this huge trade imbalance. I mean, we account for something like 19% of China's surplus, trade surplus. So we might only be 3% of China's total trade, but we're 19% of their surplus. That gives us a certain leverage.
Yeah.
Secondly, we are a major destination for Chinese project exports. So we do have leverage in this relationship. And I think now is the time. You have a crisis. Here's a chance to rejig, to rebalance that economic relationship that you have with China. The apps is one part of it. But there are other parts also. In the last 6 years, you've had something like $26 billion worth of Chinese investment in India. China has a huge presence in your telecom, in power, in fintech. Most of your fintech companies use either Chinese technology or have Chinese money, or both. So there's a whole series of issues there in terms of dependencies for critical infrastructure. All of these, I think this is a very good time for government to actually review them and to see how to actually move it forward in a direction which works better for us as India.
But you're speaking of a lot of pain if you're going to draw down from, you know, these economic areas.
You know, the reason I say it's an opportunity is because there's a great amount of pain already. I mean, you've had an economic crash thanks to COVID. And in our case, frankly, we had an economic crisis even before COVID. COVID just made it worse.
Right.
And so now is the time, if you are going to rejig your relationship and to bear certain costs and a certain amount of pain, as you say, now is the time to do it. And do it and come out of it stronger and with a better relationship, better economic relationship, something that works for you.
So you must rejig the relationship.
I think you have no choice, because in any case, this is not going to be the same relationship as before. Mm-hmm. I think it is going to be much more adversarial. I think what the Chinese have done has broken whatever understandings there were of future Chinese behavior. And I think we have to re-examine those first principles again.
Okay, so two questions from there. The first is that you're saying that India must be ready to absorb some pain in the economic sphere. But what about in the military sphere? I mean, you did say that the military guys know what they're doing. But would you say that if you were confronted once again with the kind of brutality that you had on the 15th of June, that Indian soldiers should also perhaps cross the LAC and do an eye for an eye?
Look, I'm not going to sit here and say what the general should do, what some brigadier should do. That's not. I think the larger point is that there was an effective form of deterrence, which I think came from the fact that the balance on the border was never as skewed as, say, a comparison of GDP figures or a comparison of defense budgets would suggest. There has been an effective balance on the border. Both sides had the capacity to embarrass each other militarily, and therefore the peace had held. Now the peace has been broken, which suggests to me that deterrence no longer operates. So your first job, therefore, is to reestablish that.
Okay.
And how you do it, frankly, is not for you and me to sit here and say. That is something you have to restore the effective balance, which kept the peace, if you want peace on the border.
But I would like to press you on the death of these 15 soldiers. You followed this relationship for so many decades. How did you respond to that?
Frankly, I thought it was barbaric. And I was amazed that an army that's as disciplined as the PLA would do this. And it cannot have happened without orders, without approvals. And that is why I'm really concerned about the relationship. Because those are the kinds of decisions that actually can affect and do affect the relationship going forward for years. So that's why I say there's no going back.
So the deaths of these 20 soldiers was like
it does mark a huge shift.
And somebody in the Chinese leadership, in the political leadership, would you say, or in the military?
I don't know how. It has to be political. But in China, political, military, it is the army of the party.
Right.
And the party does control the gun. That it always has and has insisted on doing so. So I don't draw a distinction there.
So I
don't accept ideas that, some rogue local commander or somebody did something. I know it's a popular explanation whenever something happens, but I don't accept that for the PLA.
So it would not be spontaneous that, that there were these two, that the Indian soldiers and the Chinese were fighting bare hands, after all.
Not in my opinion.
So what do you think changed in Beijing? You're saying that, this peace has held since 1988, since the Rajiv Gandhi visit. So what changed now?
Well, I think 3 or 4 things have changed. I think one is, if you look at the overall context, both India and China have changed. Our definitions of our interests, India and China, have actually expanded. And we now rub up against each other in the periphery that we share.
Yeah.
Nepal is their neighbor and our neighbor, right? And these are places where now suddenly China is active in Nepal's internal politics, is willing to be involved. Right. Myanmar's internal politics, she's brokering talks with the separatist group. She's much more active. Her BRI involves huge commitments in the subcontinent itself, not just in Pakistan, but in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, elsewhere.
Right.
So you are rubbing up against each other. Secondly, and this seems to be part of a broader pattern of Chinese behavior. If you look at Chinese behavior, and this is really even post-COVID, they have actually become more assertive in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, with Taiwan, in Hong Kong. They're willing to go against the agreements that they signed and impose a national security law, which is passed entirely in Beijing, without any consultation with the legislative organs in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And so across the board, there's a pushing forward. Now, there's 2 possible explanations. Also, China-US relations have now deteriorated considerably. They're much more contentious than they have been for many years. I think the US has shifted from a sort of engage and hedge to contain and push back, actually. So So given that situation, it seems to me that there are two possible explanations. One is China thinks the world's in chaos, COVID, economic crash, etc. Now is an opportunity to pursue her interests wherever. The other, to my mind, more likely, is that China takes more risks abroad when she actually feels more threatened, when her internal stability is also not quite 100% guaranteed. And this is not a good time. If you look at the Chinese economy, has gone down, unemployment is very high. The COVID could come back anytime, nobody really knows. Yes, they have been relatively successful, we're told, but those we don't know. And China is isolated internationally, more so than at any time since the Cultural Revolution, probably. So, and it could be that immediately after COVID, there were several signs within China of people questioning the policies and the course that China had adopted, and questioning the leadership and so on. All that has been squashed very successfully. And we really don't know. But if that kind of thing if there is tension, and China today spends more on internal security than she does on national defense. So in that situation, this could be just part of a broader sort of wolf warrior diplomacy, wolf warrior behavior, which we are witnessing. But we're guessing here.
Right.
We can say, yes, I think it's likely, it's not likely, but we will not know for some time.
Sure. Would you say that one of the ways to counter this this new aggression is perhaps for India to make its own friends, reach out and reinvent old friendships with Russia, with the US, with other nations in the region?
But this is part, I think you need to take one step back and look at this over a much longer period. If you look at the last 20 years, we have responded to the rise of China in a host of ways. We did a lot of self-strengthening.
Yeah.
Whether you look at the border, for instance, in 2010, we raised 2 new mountain divisions. In 2013, we approved the raising of a mountain strike corps.
Yeah.
The advanced landing grounds were opened up. 2004, we approved 72 of these roads along the border, general staff roads, one of which is the road to DBO, which is now in the news.
The Daulat Beg Oldie airstrip.
Daulat Beg Oldie. We've done a whole host of things over time to strengthen ourselves, our posture on the border, but also strengthen ourselves. We've also transformed our relationship with the US during this period, if you look at the last 20 years. And this is all governments. I mean, it's not one government or another. It's nobody's personal property here. We've also worked much more closely with a whole host of countries in Asia who are also worried about the rise of China and China's behavior. Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia, Singapore, etc. We do much more in terms of defense, security, and other kinds of cooperation with them today than we did 20 years ago. And most of this has really started around 2005, 2008, the first defense agreement with Japan, and so on. And so what we're seeing actually is it's not because of Ladakh happened, we have to. I think what we're seeing is more of the same from China. And we, therefore, I think, need to reinforce success and see what works and what doesn't work. Clearly, what has happened so far is not enough because Ladakh happened, right? And Galwan happened.
Right.
And the killings happened. So we need to sit and study this and look at this seriously. Once we're past the crisis, I think we need to do a proper analysis for ourselves and learn from it. We've done it in the past. After every crisis, whether it was Kargil, whether it was, we have actually done it and then learned and changed and evolved.
But the Americans have come out so strongly that Donald Trump has said very comforting words for India, very critical about the Chinese. Mike Pompeo has said several things. But do you think that India should get closer to the Americans, if only because it is a declining power? Or would you not agree with that?
I don't think the US is a declining power. I mean, I'm old enough to remember at least 4 times when the US was declared dead or dying.
Okay.
You know, Vietnam War, you name it. I mean, I was in the US in the 60s when everybody was on the streets saying it's all over. Barry Goldwater was a Republican candidate. No, I've seen this too often. And each time the US actually remakes herself. Because the US, like India, does all this in public, right? Washes all her dirty linen in public. And the world participates in this. It's a great spectator sport.
Right.
But they normally come out of it, actually, they change themselves and they have a capacity to reinvent themselves, which is rare in great powers. In fact, I can't think of another great power who does that. But that's a different argument. I think the fact is the Chinese must have known when they did this, that they would be pushing India even closer to the US. I mean, if you look at public opinion in India, is much more positive about Trump.
Yeah.
And the US, of course, but about Trump than the global average, or even among allies in Europe, US allies in Europe. So the Chinese must have known. It seems to me that, therefore, one has to wonder about why they chose to do it at this time. But at the same time, I think Indian expectations also need to be tempered. I mean, these are wonderful words. But you know, the border is not going to be pacified, or the situation, the status quo is not going to be restored by the US.
Right.
Or by words from the US. And some of those words, after all, President Trump offered to mediate. Now that's a neutral position.
Yeah.
That's not, but then he said other things which were supportive. We should be grateful for that, and we should work with the US. The US is ready to work with us to help us strengthen ourselves so that we can deal with these issues, and we should work with the US. We have transformed our relationship, and I think in the last few years we've taken several further steps, which I think are good. I think we need to do that. But we also mustn't expect the US to do our job for us.
Right. But do you care, Mr. Menon, when people say that, oh, if India gets closer to the US, then you will be abandoning your traditional sort of non-alignment positions and perhaps, and even worse, become, within quotes, a junior ally of the US?
You know, it seems to me as long as we are pursuing India's interest and we take the decisions ourselves, I don't see what you're worried about. When I say strategic autonomy, that's what I mean. It doesn't mean I won't talk to anyone, I won't work with anyone. That's not what autonomy means. Autonomy means that you still have the capacity to decide and to choose for yourself based on your own enlightened self-interest. And that, I think, is what we've been doing. You can call it by different names. Non-alignment is what we used to use. Other people use genuine non-alignment. I think from Mr. Vajpayee's time, we started using strategic autonomy. You can use any word you like, but basically it's our own independence and our ability to choose based on our own interests. Because nobody shares your interest 100%.
Right.
I mean, you are unique in several ways, just as all the other great powers are. And to the extent that your interests overlap, you will work together. And today you do have a huge overlap with the US. So you should, I think, develop it.
Right. So last couple of questions. As India and China rub up against each other much more, say in the neighborhood, you gave the example of Nepal. Pakistan is, of course, a strategic partner. Sri Lanka has, there have been so many differences. Do you think that India should perhaps improve its relations, its ties with all these other South Asian nations? Because right now it seems as if the government doesn't have such good ties with most South Asian countries.
Well, I think we should do much more in the immediate neighborhood, in the subcontinent, with our other neighbors, in two fundamental respects. One is the economic integration of the subcontinent, because we still do have strengths and capabilities and affinities among ourselves, which we need to build on. The other is, I think we should become, in their eyes especially, a provider of security rather than a threat to their identity and security. And I think that is very important.
Are
part
the
of the
Chinese becoming a
problem,
provider of their security increasingly?
I think part of the problem is if we start treating relations with our neighbors as domestic politics, and purely from the point of view of domestic politics, then you get into the kinds of situations you're in now. I mean, you cannot call, Bangladeshi migrants termites and expect the Bangladeshis to be happy after that. There's a whole host of things where you might have domestic compulsions, but there is a line to be drawn here where there is a larger national interest, which should be above party political interests in winning one election or another. And that's very important. I think in the neighborhood, actually, we underestimate the levels of goodwill and common interests that we have among ourselves. We just need to work them. And I think we can work them and develop a much more peaceful periphery. But especially now, when the world is so troubled, when you look at the global situation, the world is between orders, when China-US relations are where the world is fragmenting economically into regional economic blocs, all the more reason to consolidate the neighborhood and to make this a region, a periphery of peace for us.
So absolutely the last question, and I'd like to ask you about the 2005 India-China agreement that you had, and you were then very much part of it, which is...
I was in Pakistan.
2005, you were High Commissioner in Pakistan, of course, when then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, under his leadership, signed this agreement on guiding principles and parameters regarding the settlement of the boundary.
Yeah.
Now, what was that about, and why did nothing come of it?
Well, the SRs, in fact, the special representatives on the border, which had been set up during Mr. Vajpayee's visit in 2003 to Beijing, when I was ambassador, actually.
Yeah.
They had agreed on a three-step process. That first we would agree the broad principles for a boundary settlement. Then we do a framework, reduce those principles to a framework. And lastly, we'd apply the framework and produce a line on a map, which would amount to a boundary settlement. So that was really the first step of something that had been agreed between Mr. Brajesh Mishra and Taipingpo, actually, and had been carried forward. If you look at our policy towards China, whether it was from Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh, there was a fair degree of continuity in that policy. It's after 2012 that actually you started seeing all these signs of stress in the relationship. And I think there was progress made in the talks on the boundary settlement during those years.
Between 2005 to 12?
Between 2003 to about 2012.
Okay.
There was progress. And in fact, the SRs actually had summed it up and so on, and given it to the two governments. But we still had crucial differences, which was why we didn't have a final framework.
So what did you have? What did you agree upon?
We had large elements, large portions of the framework were ready. But ultimately you come to certain big political decisions which both sides have to take. After all, the SRs only represent the special representatives. They cannot on their own cook up something if they're not authorized to do that.
But what were these political decisions?
You need to take some very big political decisions. Ultimately, the political leadership has to change the way you and I were taught to draw the map of India in school. Same for the Chinese leaders. They have to be willing to take that call.
Which means
what? That's a big ask of any political leader. And especially today, when leaders rely on nationalism for their legitimacy, much more than ever before. So I think, So
now, can I just ask you, what did that mean, though, when you say that?
It means they have to decide what kind of border they can live with. And both sides have to be willing to live with the same boundary at the same time.
So right now, if India doesn't have control or de facto control, at least over, say, the Aksai Chin area, and hasn't since 1962 or perhaps even before, and has control over the entire Arunachal Pradesh, including Tawan, which is presumably what the Chinese want. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's not what I'm saying. And both sides have said that the status quo is not an acceptable basis for a settlement.
Okay.
So then they both have to agree on something else, right? From the status quo.
What could it be?
They haven't agreed. What it could be any one of 1,000 things. But that's not, today there's no point speculating about it. Ultimately, the political leaderships have to feel comfortable with that. It's the same thing at the same time. And that's a
But
big
the map
ask.
of India and the map of China would change.
Would change if you want to settle boundary.
Right. I mean, that's clearly an ambitious idea, which I don't know
It is. And I'm not sure that this is the time in the middle of a crisis to be talking about it.
But ultimately, there isn't really any other option but to come back to that idea, isn't it?
I think ultimately you will have to. And this is why we have both sides have gone back to the table over and over again.
And come back to talk to each other, because we're both going to remain neighbors. Nobody else is.
As Mr. Bajpai used to say, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your neighbors.
Right. Mr. Menon, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you as always. And please do read us at ThePrint. Tell us what you think. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.